So welcome back to another module with me, CSS and JavaScript. This course, of course, is about CSS and we'll focus on CSS. This won't become a JavaScript course. But still, you can interact with CSS with JavaScript. You can change styles after the page was loaded, and there are cases where you actually need to do this. In our project too. You will see that we got two cases, two things we can introduce, we can add, two features we can add to our project by taking advantage of JavaScript's capabilities. So in this module, we'll learn how we may manipulate styles with JavaScript, so how we can change the styling of an element after our page has been loaded. And you will also learn how you can, in cases where you don't want to directly manipulate styles, how you can add or remove CSS classes with JavaScript. These are two core features that all of a sudden allow you to change styles during runtime. So let's dive right into this and let's add some examples to our course project. So back in the course project, I want to start by taking advantage of that backdrop you added in the last course module. I want to make sure that we can click these Choose Plan buttons, and of course we could directly redirect the user to some other page, but here I really want to open a modal, which is like a pop-up in the page, you could say. You know it from a lot of pages. It's an overlay over the other content of your page, so to say. Now you already added this backdrop with manual. Here, this backdrop div, which you added to your HTML files, this will be one piece of the modal. It will be the background of the modal so that we can't click any other content on the page. The other part is the modal itself, so the content we want to overlay. And attached to this video, you find the HTML code for that modal. So copy that code and add it right after or in front of your backdrop here, like this. Now this code here simply is just a div with the h1 tag where we say, do you want to continue? And then a class modal actions where we essentially render two different buttons. One of them is a link styled as a button which says yes, and the other one is a normal button which says no, which should just close the modal. Now here we navigate to start hosting index.html. That's the last missing page of our project. We'll add it later, but for now it's nice to have that button already. And of course, you see we got a bunch of CSS classes added to our modal elements here. And to take advantage of these classes and style this modal in a nice way, we need CSS code. Attached to this video, you also find a CSS file with the styles for this modal. So simply open that file and copy these styles you find in there into your main.css file, maybe just towards the end of that file. In there, you find things you already learned about: position fixed, set index, top, left, width, background color, box shadow, and borders, some alignment stylings here. Also, maybe new, this cursor pointer, which just makes sure that when we hover over the button that we got this pointer cursor, so which turns our mouse cursor into a cursor that looks like a clickable element, or that we are over a clickable element, and some pseudo classes to change the styling when we hover over the different buttons and so on. That's really all that our modal requires. Now, please keep in mind, this set index here of the modal has to be higher than the set index of our backdrop, because the backdrop, which has a set index of 100, should be in front of the other content we got, but the modal itself then again should be in front of the backdrop. So if we add all that and we save that, we can reload our page and we don't actually see anything. The reason for that is that for the modal, just as with the backdrop, we got a display style of none. Now we can comment this out, so let's comment it out, so to essentially show our modal. And let's also comment out the display style of the backdrop, so that both are not none. And if we reload the page now, this is how our modal will look in the end. This is the modal we added and which I want to show when we click such a button. Of course, it shouldn't be always shown as it is now, though. It should only show up, well, once we did click a button. And it should disappear once we click the backdrop or the no button, or the yes button, but there we simply navigate to a different page, which we haven't added yet anyways. So what I'll do is, I'll set this back to display none, both for the backdrop and the modal, and in the next lecture, we'll start adding some JavaScript to essentially change this display property whenever we want to show or hide the modal and the backdrop. So let's do that in the next lecture. So our goal is to dynamically change the display property. And for that, we need to understand how we can, in general, change the style of elements with JavaScript. Why with JavaScript? Because JavaScript is the only tool we got which allows us to run code after the page has been loaded. And with this code, we can of course change the content or the styling of the page. Now, you don't need to know JavaScript to continue with this module here though. I will explain carefully what we do. It will help working with JavaScript in general if you pick up a JavaScript focused course along the way though. But for this course, to complete this course, you'll definitely not need it. So we need to add JavaScript, and we could add it inline in our index.html file by adding script tags like this. We can add them in the head section or in the body section, and also at the end of the body section, which typically is the wiser way of doing it, because this way it will ensure that all the HTML code has been parsed already and we can safely access it at the point of time our script runs. I, however, won't add my script code to the HTML file. I'll put it in a separate JavaScript file, as we did it for our CSS code too. So I'll simply create a new file in the project folder, and I'll name it shared.js, because actually the code I put in here will be shared across the different pages of the project. Now that shared.js file can now be imported with the help of these script tags, and you need an opening and closing script tag, that's important. And here in the index.html file, in our root project folder, at the end of the body section, but before the closing body tag, I'll add script source src, and now simply a link to the shared.js file. Basically just as we did it with the CSS imports, the import syntax is just a bit different. With that, we execute that shared.js file, and a quick way of demonstrating this is to simply throw an alert where we say this works. This will create a browser default overlay alert, and let's see how this looks like. If I reload this page, here we see this works. That is how such a browser alert looks like. It's not the best user experience, so we're not going to use this for our normal UI interaction with the user. So let's get rid of that alert. It was just a test to see if the file is getting imported. And let's instead now focus on accessing the styles of HTML elements. This actually is a two-step process. First of all, we need to get access to a so-called DOM element. The DOM is essentially what the browser makes of our HTML code. It parses the HTML code and then creates a virtual representation of it, the document object model, or in short, the DOM. And we can essentially access the elements in the DOM via JavaScript and then manipulate them. We can manipulate their attributes, we can execute certain actions, we can listen to events on them, we can access their styles, we can access their CSS classes, we can access their content, we can even add and remove elements. These are all things you learn in a JavaScript focus course though. We'll focus on selecting the elements and working with their styles or CSS classes. So how do we select the element? Let's go back to the index.html file and let's try selecting that backdrop. Now, how could we do that? You can actually select elements with JavaScript in a similar way as you select them via CSS. You can select them by tag, by ID, by attribute, or by class. And the detailed ways of selecting elements, again, are the topic of a JavaScript focus course. The general approach always is the same. So let me show you how it works. In the shared.js file, I'll first of all create a so-called variable to store the selected element, you could say, so that we can later use it. I want to select the backdrop, so I'll name the variable backdrop, but the variable name is really up to you. It doesn't have to be the same name as the class. This is not required. So this variable should hold a value. It should hold a reference to the HTML element, to the DOM element. And we do this by using the document object. This is a default element, you can say, we can access in the JavaScript code provided by the browser. It gives us access to the parsed document. Remember, I was talking about the document object model? Well, this gives us basically access to the document object model. On the document, we can access a lot of properties and methods, and the method we'll need to get access to an element is the query selector method. Query selector is executed like this with parentheses, and then we pass an argument within the parentheses. And this argument now actually is just a normal CSS selector, just as you could put it into your CSS code too. You can use a tag here, an ID, an attribute selector, or a class selector. And you can also use combinators, like you could do some class and then another class to point at an element which has another class which has some parent with some class. Here, however, I'm interested in an element with backdrop. So this is how I can select my backdrop. Now here's a nice way of seeing what we actually selected. We can use console log backdrop like this. Let's save that code and go back to the page. And now make sure to open your developer tools and open that console tab there. If you now reload the page, you should see the log here coming from our JavaScript files, and it should log the element it's selected. It logs it in element view here. If you change console log to console dir, you actually see it in an object notation. Now this is basically the object you can now work with in JavaScript, and you see it's an object with a lot of properties and methods you can call. This is the DOM representation of the HTML element, and it is what we can work with. Now important, our backdrop here essentially selects elements by class. Now query selector will always just select one element, the first element with that selector it finds. Since this is a CSS class selector, it could find multiple occurrences. Now query selector, as I just said, will always select the first one. If you get a case where you need to get access to all of them in a so-called array, you can use query selector all. Now this would select all elements with the backdrop class and would return an array. If I now save this and reload, you see we got a node list essentially, and we would have to access the element with the index 0, which is the first element, to get access to the first element with the backdrop. And if we had multiple elements, we would have, well, multiple elements in that list. However, back to query selector, because I just want to have the first element. I only got one anyways. I just wanted to show you that this alternative exists. So this is how we access an element. If we now reload again to see it, let's inspect which properties we got here. You see we got a bunch of properties here with all kinds of information. And a very interesting one when it comes to styling can be found towards the end of that list, the style property. Now if we expand this, we actually see all the style properties we can set for this element and their respective values. Now one thing that can be confusing, if you scroll down to set index, for example, you actually see that it has no value here. It's empty. Now, if we inspect our CSS code for the backdrop though, in main CSS, in shared CSS, you see that we actually have a set index of 100. So why can't we see this here? Because all the styles here are added as inline styles to the element. And this element, as all our elements, got no inline styles. And that's important. The style property allows you to access inline styles. I'll also show you how to access classes later in this module. For now, let's work with these inline styles. Since inline styles override all other styles, we can simply manipulate a style with the help of that style property to, well, change the appearance or the look of the element. Back in our shared.js file, what we can do, instead of logging this, is we can access the backdrop and then the style property we just saw, and then there, maybe, for example, the display property. And keep in mind, we set it to none in our class. Now here we set inline styles, and we can set a new value by simply adding an equal sign and then assigning the new value, which has to be a string and then block, for example. This will override our display none style from the CSS class. Therefore, if I save this JavaScript file and I reload again, we see the backdrop again. It's again there because if we inspect it, we can see in our styles that we set display block here as an inline style, which overrides our class display none style. This is how we can select elements in JavaScript and how we can manipulate the styles. Now let's also add an event listener to not do this by default, but to instead manipulate what needs to be manipulated whenever we click one of these choose plan buttons here. So let's work on these choose plan buttons now. For that, we need to manipulate the styles, but not by default when this JavaScript code first runs, but when an event occurs. And for that, we need to add a so-called event listener to the HTML element we wanna, listen to. That's not the backdrop in our case, that is the choose plan button instead. So our button down there. Now that of course means that we somehow need to select this button. And for that I'll go back to my JavaScript code and call this select plan button. You can name this variable whatever you want. It will hold a reference to these buttons. So for that we again use document. But now I need to register 3 event listeners, 1 to each button. So I actually want to select all the buttons. And I already told you that for this, we can use query selector all. Now query selector all still takes a string as an argument, which allows us to define a CSS selector. And if we have a look at our HTML code, we see that we're interested in a button element, but not necessarily in every button on our page, but in a button which is inside of, let's say, an element with the plan class. So therefore, we can use a combinator here and say, select any element which is inside of a plan class element and which is in turn a button element. This will give us a list of all the buttons in our plans. And we can again see this by using console.dir select plan button, or buttons is a better name actually because it's more than one. And if I now reload the page and go back to the console in the developer tools, we see we got a node list with 3 buttons indeed. So that's looking good. Now with that, we can add our event listener to these buttons. Now since we got an array, I actually need to loop through these buttons. I need to execute an action for every element in that array. Now for that, we can use a for loop. Now that is just a construct in JavaScript which allows us to repeat code. And we need to pass 3 arguments to that for loop here. The first is a iteration variable, a temporary variable which we use to keep track about how often we executed the loop and how often we still have to execute it. And typically you use I here for iteration, but you can name this whatever you want. And we set an initial value of 0. Keep in mind that in the select plan buttons list, the first element had an index of 0, so this will help us selecting that first element for the first run of this loop. Then we add a semicolon, and next we enter the condition for this loop. So how long should this loop keep on running? It should keep on running as long as I is smaller than select plan buttons length. Length is a special property which simply tells us how many elements we got. Now we will have 3 elements, and therefore this will keep on running until it is 2. For 2, it will still be executed, but once I reaches 3, it will not execute the code again because 3 is not smaller than 3. Now we need to add a third argument separated with another semicolon, and this is essentially just the code which should run whenever we finished one loop iteration. It should increment I by 1, which we simply do by typing I++. This will add 1 to I after each run through that loop. Then we add curly braces, and inside of that, we add the code we want to execute for each run. And there, I want to access select plan buttons For my element I, with squared brackets, we access a certain element in that array. And now we can call the special addEventListener method. Now here we add two arguments. The first is the event we want to listen to. In our case, this is the click event. The second argument is the code we want to execute whenever this event occurs. And for that, we can use a function. A function is simply a construct of code which won't run immediately when this file is getting executed, but only when it's called. And here our function will get called when the click occurs. We are actually defining a so-called anonymous function here because we're not giving it a special name, because we're never calling it from anywhere else in our code. A function is defined with the function keyword, then parentheses, and then curly braces which hold the content of that function. Now in that function we define the code which should run when we click such a button. And now it's inside of there that we actually want to show the backdrop and the modal. Now for that we also need to select the modal. Now in the index.html file we see the modal has the class modal. So let's also get access to that with another variable, modal, document, and now query selector, because not all, we only want to get the first and only modal we got, selecting it by the modal CSS class. And therefore in this function, we can now access modal, style, and then display and set it to block, to show it as a block element and not none, which will not show it. I'll duplicate this to also change the style of the backdrop. Now this should also be set to block when we click the button. With that, make sure to save all files and reload your page. And now if you click one of these buttons, it will actually show the modal. Now we can't remove the modal yet. This is something you can practice in the next lecture, but this is a great first step. So now that we learned the basics about how we can work with JavaScript and CSS, I want to prepare our project to become real responsive by adding a side navigation. Essentially a side navigation bar that should open when we click a to be added button here in our main toolbar at the top. That should open whenever we click this button to allow us to navigate to packages, customers, and so on from there. Because later in the course, in the next module actually, we'll start turning our page into a responsive web page so that it looks good on mobile devices too. Right now, if we decrease the size, it starts to look ugly and we definitely need to change that. Therefore, having such a side navigation is already a great first step, and that's why we'll add it now. For this, again, you find some code attached to this video. The first code snippet is HTML code, which you should add below your main nav header here in your index.html file in the root project folder. So between the closing of header and in front of the main section, add the HTML code you find attached to this video, this nav element. Now here you actually see we got a nav HTML element with a bunch of classes on the nested elements, and then our links to packages, customers, and start hosting, which we don't really have yet, but which we'll add soon. We also need some CSS code for this to work, and you find that code attached to this video too. That should be added to the shared CSS file, added anywhere in that file. I'll add it below my other CSS code, my other navigation code, in front of the buttons though. Here are a bunch of mobile nav CSS classes, which essentially give this mobile navigation a nice look. You see here we also use just fixed, set index, width, height of 100 VH to ensure that it always takes the full page height without the 100% cascading trick. And yeah, essentially that's it. Now what we also need to do for that to work correctly is we need to add some selectors to our other class selectors we got in the shared CSS file. Let's start with the main nav item anchor tag selector here. Now this link style also should be applied to our .mobile -nav __item anchor tag, so that the links in our mobile navigation also look good. Next up, we got our CTA style here, our call to action button. Here I'll also add another style with a comma separated again. Mobile-nav __ item CTA anchor tag should also receive that style. And now last but not least, here our main nav CTA hover at active styles. Here I'll also add mobile-nav __ item -- CTA anchor hover, and then the same just for the active style, like this. With that, if we save all of that and we reload, we don't actually see anything, because if you go back to the shared file, you will see that the mobile nav by default has a display of none. Let's remove that temporarily, and let's reload. And this is what it will look like. Not super pretty because it's way too big. It will look good on smaller devices later. This is what we'll actually work on though. We'll change the styling then to ensure that it looks good. We want to ensure that on small devices, like maybe here, this iPhone, it looks nice. It doesn't right now. We'll work on this in the next module. We can already work on showing this upon the click of a button though. So let's add display none again. And let's add a button which allows us to show that, that side navigation when we click on it as a next step. Now that button which I want to add also is added by adding some HTML code which you find attached to this video. And you should add that code in the main navigation now, here right in front of our uhost brand, inside the div, but outside of the anchor tag, next to the anchor tag, this button code should be added. If you reload, you should see this strange button. Now it'll also need some styling to look good, and that styling can also be found attached to this video. Now you can add it anywhere you want. Since it is placed next to the brand, I will also add the styling next to the brand, maybe here. And it should be this toggle button class and then the two other toggle button related classes. Now what is this doing here? This is just creating a button which has a fixed width with a background which should be transparent, no padding top and bottom, but aligning in the middle to its neighbor elements. And here I also want to have a width of 100% for the bars inside the button. If you inspect the HTML code again, you see we got 3 spans inside of the button which have this toggle button bar class. Now, this class is targeted with this selector, and there we give them the width of the button, a height, then a background color of black, and then also a margin to the top and bottom so that the bars are separated from each other. They also are display block. If we save that and we reload, we get this hamburger menu icon here. Now this looks strange here for the single reason that we gave this button a width of 3 rem, but for our navigation here, where we calculate its width, we're deducting, not enough. This anyways is code that definitely needs to improve, and we will improve it. For now, let's simply increase that. Now 3 rem would be 48 pixels by default. So let's change this to 122 pixels and reload. Now it's back in line, and yes, this is bad code. We will improve this. Now one thing I also need to improve is I need to add vertical align middle to the main header brand element here. With that, if we reload, this is now centered in the middle next to the button. Now this button here should be clickable, and when we click it, that side navigation should open. With it all prepared now, let's work on that opening part, for which we will use JavaScript in the next lecture. So we want to open our side menu when we click that button. Now let's first of all do that with the way we already know. We need to select our button here. So our toggle button, we can get access to it, for example, with the toggle button class, and add an event listener, which in turn should somehow show our mobile nav, to which we can also get action through its selector here, through its class selector, and then change the display property. Well, let's quickly do that. Let's add two new variables to our JavaScript code. The first one is the toggle button. And here I will use document query selector as we learned it. And now here we can use the toggle button class, which is added to the button as we just saw. And I'll add a second variable, which is my mobile nav. And these variable names, as mentioned before, are always up to you. Now there I will also use my query selector and select it by the mobile nav CSS class which it has. So now we got access to these two elements. Now I just need to add event listeners. So I'll add an event listener to my toggle button by using the add event listener method and listening to a click event. And I want to execute a function here whenever this is clicked. Now in this function I want to change the style of my site nav. So we'll use mobile nav style display and set it to block here. Now it should actually be closed when we click a backdrop. So I will copy that and go to my, well, close modal method, I guess, which we are triggering when we have a click on the backdrop. So maybe here we actually should use another anonymous function again. And now in that function set mobile nav style display to none. But since we also still want to close that modal, we can also execute this close modal here. Now this will also run if the modal isn't even open, but it won't hurt. The display style would have been none anyways in that case. So now we got code to close the site nav when we click the backdrop and open it when we click the toggle button. Let's save this and go back to our code and reload the page. If I now click this hamburger menu, you see it opens, but we can't click the backdrop because it didn't open, because I forgot to also set the backdrop style to block here. So let's add backdrop style display block in our function which runs when we click the toggle button. And now with that saved, if we reload again, now we also get a backdrop and we can now also close that side menu. However, the backdrop doesn't disappear. And this is because I accidentally wrote this here. You might have wondered what this means anyways. We don't need it. It should just be close modal in our backdrop event listener. Sorry about that. So just close modal, that's our function name. Now for a last time, if we reload, this opens and this closes. And our modal also still works, as you can see. So this is now all working as it should. And we can also navigate around. We don't have our hamburger icon on the other pages. We'll add it there. But before we do that, let's actually change the way we open and close the menu. This does work, no question. But actually, let me show you an alternative way of changing styles by attaching and removing CSS classes. So we managed to open and close our modal. Now let me show you another way of doing that. We could also add a new class. Let's name it open maybe, and I'll add it to the shared CSS file at the very bottom because it's not limited to the mobile navigation. Open could set display to block. And now if we analyze our shared JavaScript code, we actually can see that we always set our display style to block or to none, which for all the cases is the default of our CSS classes anyways. So for the backdrop, for example, or the modal, display is none. The same for the backdrop, display is none by default. So we actually only need a second class, the open class, which switches it to block when needed. And now we will just need to add this class via JavaScript whenever we need to change the style. This is what I want to show you now. So for that, we still need to select the elements. We still need to add listeners, but we won't edit the styles like this. Let me remove that or comment it out so that we still have it for reference. Instead, we can access modal, and then there is a class name property. Now, class name actually is a string which holds the same value as our class attribute here does. So if we have one and more class here, it will still be one string with the words separated by white spaces, just as we have it here. Now we could change class name to open. The problem with that is it would then really put class equal to open. And if we had other classes that shouldn't be removed, like for example, for our backdrop, we don't want to get rid of the backdrop class, we just want to add the open class, then with this approach, we would actually overwrite it. Now this div class backdrop would become div class open. Not necessarily what we want. And the same for the modal here in this case actually. So let me comment this out and add a comment here. This will actually overwrite the complete class list. And that already gives us a hint. We can think of our classes on an element as a list of classes. So it would be nice if we had an easy way of adding and removing elements to and from that list. And we can do that with another property, the class list property. This is an object which provides some helper methods, as you can see here, like for example, for checking if it contains a certain class. This can be used in if conditions, for adding a class, or for removing a class, or even for toggling a class, which will automatically remove it if it's active or add it if it is not active. Now you can work with toggle here. I will use add and remove. And here in this case, I want to add a class, the open class, without a dot at the beginning, just a name. And this will add a CSS class open to the modal. And this is great because we got an open class which will set all the styles we want to set. This allows us to still access or write our styles in style sheets and then control the attachment of that class with JavaScript. Now I'll copy that and do the same for the backdrop. With that, if we change that and we reload our page, if we click choose plan, we still open the backdrop, but the modal actually doesn't show up. The reason for this is that the open class is added, but it's overwritten by the modal class. And the reason for that is really that we define the open class in the shared CSS file, whereas we have the modal class in the main CSS file, which is imported as a second file, and therefore, as you learned, this overrides any styles with the same specificity that were defined earlier, like for our open class. So what we can do, and here this really is okay, we can add important here. I told you that you shouldn't really use this to override specificity, but here it's okay because this really is a class that we only add when it should take absolute priority. Another solution would be to simply reposition the modal class in front of the open class, but I think this approach is really okay here too. So with that, if we save that and reload, now we actually see the modal too. We can't get rid of it though, because we now got important on our display property. Maybe one downside you could say, but we want to get rid of it in another way anyways. I want to go to my close modal function here and not set the styles with the old approach, but instead use my class list again and simply remove the open class with this code. And the same for the backdrop. Now with that, if we save again and we reload, we can open our modal and close it, just like that. But this time, if you watch here on the right, you see that not the inline styles get edited, but the class list gets edited automatically simply by running the add and remove commands on the class list. Of course, we can do the same for the mobile nav. We can comment it out here and use mobile nav class list remove open here, because that's the backdrop click. We want to close it here. But also down there on the toggle button, there I actually want to call add. And the same, of course, for the backdrop. Now if we reload, we can actually open the modal still and also the side menu. This all works just nice now. So with that, we're using a different approach, the class list. And that is the other great and important way you have of editing elements. So in this module, we learned a lot about how we can change styles with the style property or by adding classes or manipulating classes. Now let me console.dir any element like the backdrop, for example, again, and let's dive into the style property for a second again. If we reload and go to the console, here we see the backdrop. Now let's go down to style, and you might have noticed it before. If you watch closely, we didn't recognize it for display because it's only one word, but for other things like background image and a lot of other multi-word properties, they are written in a different way than you use it when writing CSS code in CSS files or in HTML files. You don't have a dash between background and image then starts with a capital I. The reason for this is that property names, you can call this variables and objects, so to say, are invalid if they contain a dash. That is why the notation differs slightly. Essentially, whenever you have a CSS property that consists of multiple words, like border radius, and you want to change this directly from within JavaScript, you would change it to one word where the dash is omitted and the word after the dash starts with a capital character. So border radius in this case here. This is simply something you have to keep in mind. You have to change the syntax without a dash, but with a capital character after the dash. You got an alternative though. In the shared JSF file, if I access style, background image, I just showed you, this will work. We reload. We just see nothing because no value is assigned, but you do see an empty line, so it did execute. You can also access it in a different notation by using squared brackets right after style, no dot in between, and then passing a string to these square brackets. And in there, you now use the normal CSS property name, like background dash image. Here, since it's a string, the dash is allowed. And if you want to use the normal names as you know them, this is an alternative syntax you can use. If you now save this and you reload, you again see an empty line and no error, which means it worked. So that's important. By default, use that so-called camel case notation without a dash, but with a capital character for the separate words, or use this way of accessing the property names. If you're attaching and removing classes as we do here, you of course don't change the way you style or write your styles in your CSS file. That's not affected by JavaScript at all. This is really just needed if you directly access a style property from within your JavaScript code. So that's something important which I wanted to highlight. Now with that, let's wrap up this module. And let's wrap this module up by first of all making sure that we have this new toggle button as well as our mobile navigation available in all our files. We added the CSS code in the shared folder, in the shared CSS file, so this will be available. But now we also need to add our HTML code to the other files. For that, let's start with the nav, the mobile nav. Let's copy it and add it to the index.html file in the packages folder after header in front of main. So there. Now let's adjust the links. For packages, it's just the index.html file in that folder. For customers, we have to go up one level and then to customers. And for start hosting, eventually this will also be the case. Now let's copy it again. And let's go to customers. And there, let's also add it after header in front of main. And let's adjust the links here too. For packages, we have to go up one level and then down to packages. For customers, we're already in the right folder, so let's remove that folder navigation. And for start hosting, it stays as it is. Now again, we also need to add that hamburger button. So that button we added in front of our brand. Let's go to our brand link here, or to this button in front of it to be precise. Let's copy it and let's add it to or in front of our brand in the other pages too. So here in the index.html file in the packages folder, there in that div, right in front of that anchor tag, I'll add my button style, or button code I should say, and in customers, I'll do the same right in front of the anchor tag like this. If we now save that and reload, we can go to packages, and I actually get a 𝗧𝗚𝗢𝗏 error here, which we can ignore for now. The rest does look good here though, so this all works. Clicking on the button here, however, doesn't work. Now what's missing? The thing that's missing is simply the shared.js file. We need to import that too. So from our root index.html file at the bottom, let's copy that script import and let's add it to the other files too, right in front of the closing body tag. Now here we need to adjust the import path and go up one level, and the same for the customers page. And now since we get an error regarding that 𝗧𝗚𝗢𝗏 on packages, let's also fix it there. We simply need to go up one level here to get the right 𝗧𝗚𝗢𝗏. So now with that, we can reload. And now we're importing the JavaScript code, but now we get a new error. Can't read property add event listener of null. Now what's the problem here? The problem here is that in our JavaScript code, we're adding event listeners to our select plan buttons, and these buttons simply don't exist on the packages page or on our customers page. And therefore, this code just fails. We don't have these buttons there, so it can't succeed. This, however, is not really the problem, because this code will only run for every element we got in our button list. And if we got no buttons, the list will be empty and this code will never execute. We got one other piece of code that is related to the modal though, and that's the modal no button here. This also always executes, and that is our issue. Now here, we simply have to wrap it in an if block where we check if modal no button, just like that. This will only return true if it finds a valid reference to the button. So if we wrap the code inside of that if statement, it will not run if we get no such reference. So now if we reload on the packages page, it will work, and we can open and close the side menu. Well, closing doesn't work though. Class list can't be accessed for our backdrop. Let's quickly go into the HTML file. We got our backdrop here. But of course, the problem we have eventually is not that we can't access the backdrop, but in close modal, which we always execute, we try to remove the open class from the modal, and we also don't have a modal on other pages. So we can simply wrap that again. And of course, you could also find a different solution where you separate your to-be-executed methods clearer. Here, however, this is fine since we don't have that many other cases. So I will just wrap modal with the same code as I did with the modal no button, like this. And now this code will also only run if we got a modal. So if we reload again, now opening and closing does work. And the same on our customers page. So with that, we got our project in a state where we have JavaScript added to it to dynamically change the content during runtime and take advantage of this to manipulate what the user sees after the page has been loaded. So that's it for this module. You learned a lot about JavaScript and how you can use it in conjunction with CSS. To be precise, you learned how you may access style properties via JavaScript and change them via that style property. You learned about the importance of using the camel case notation there, so background image without a dash instead of with a dash, or by using that alternative wrapped between quotation marks as a string and by accessing the property via square brackets. And you also learned how you can add or remove CSS classes with class name, or better, if you don't want to override everything, via class list and the add and remove or toggle methods offered on that object. It's easier and more flexible than class name. Now, of course, there is way more you can learn about JavaScript, but that is something you should do in a JavaScript focused or dedicated course. We got all the tools we need for this project, and tools which are in general useful for you as a developer when you're working with CSS.